Good afternoon. My name is Leanne Lester. I'm the organizer of Art Palm Beach. We welcome you to our 15th edition of a fair. Rick, it's going to have to go back up. Okay, can you hear me now? Because it's much softer than it was yesterday. Okay, let me get through this very quick. Thank you for coming today. This is a fascinating topic, and we are delighted to have both George Wardlaw and Soltes here, who made a very special trip for us. He is teaching right now in Florence, Italy, arrived 2 weeks ago, and was very nice enough to come back for these 48 hours to make this presentation today. So for those of you who are familiar with the jet lag, hopefully, Ari, you had your Italian espresso this morning. Raised on a farm in Mississippi during the Depression, George Wardlaw emerged from meager beginnings to become a member of the avant-garde in New York City in the 50s and 60s. He would on become a very important figure in the American art scene and an influential teacher. After serving in World War II, Wardlaw used the GI Bill to attend Memphis Academy of Arts. He taught and studied at the University of Mississippi with David Smith, Jack Turklaw, and Reginald Neal. He was assistant professor at LSU and at SUNY. He was later recruited to teach at Yale before serving the chair of the art department at UMass, where he remained for the rest of his academic career. Jewish identity and intensity of the work of George Wardlaw. We're very pleased to have not only his work here today, but the new book that has just been published on his entire career. Following the lecture, out in the hallway, we will have a book signing, and he'll remain also in his two booths as a special exhibition at the Courthouse Gallery, as well as numerous other installations throughout the entire fair. Soltes is a professor and lecturer in theology and fine arts at Georgetown University and former director of the B'nai B'rith National Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., where he curated over 80 exhibitions on a variety of subjects. He's the author of articles, exhibition catalogs, essays, and books on topics ranging from fixing the world, American Jewish painters in the 20th century, our sacred signs, how Jewish, Christian, and Muslims draw from the same source, searching for oneness, Christianity and Islam, and untangling the web. We're delighted to have Soltes here to make this presentation, and of course, to have George present today.
Okay, I'll make it easier this way. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I know we're going to bring the lights down slightly so you can see what's on the screen behind me. Otherwise, you're stuck looking at me, and trust me, that's not where you want to be. You want to be looking at George's work. And what I want to do this afternoon is to provide some of the contexts for George Wardlaw's work, specifically with respect to Jewish identity and its concomitants, by starting out with the issue and the problem and the question of the word definition, which comes from a Latin root, fin, which means boundary. So to define something is to draw a boundary around it. And when one applies that issue of definition, for example, to the word Jewish, then one of the immediate questions that should occur to one is, what are the boundaries of Jewish? Are we referring to it as a religion, as a culture, as a body of customs and traditions, as an ethnicity, as a nationality, as a civilization? Any and all of those terms have been used and can apply to the word Jewish, and of course the question will become, and how does that, when we then turn to art, inform the question of the artwork? To what extent can we say that any art would be called Jewish art? To what extent, if we say that, do we mean that it's informed by a Jewish consciousness, or are there particular features, Jewish symbols, Jewish subjects, Jewish style that would apply when we use that kind of term? When we talk about the work of George Wardlaw, we're also very much talking about the issue of definitions, of boundaries, and in his case, the way in which throughout his 6-decade-long career, he has refused to stay restricted within certain definable boundaries, but has constantly transcended and transgressed boundaries, moving back and forth in different kinds of directions, whether it is in the matter of media, so moving between art and craft. So if we look, for example, here at the image on the screen before us, these are early works done in the late 40s, early 50s, toward the early part of George's career, and what you're looking at in the center are two salt shakers. And what you're looking at the right is a perfume container. And all of these, in other words, are what ordinarily, in traditional terms, would be called craft. But look at the artistry, and I don't just mean the quality of the putting them together, I mean the ideas, the visual ideas, that these are artworks. This is a salt shaker that you probably would want to put in display with your artworks and not simply to use on your table. Next slide, please. And so art and craft are boundaries that George has throughout his career transgressed, transcended. And the same can be said of painting and sculpture. So here we're looking, for example, at from a series called Caged Free, done from about 1979, and 3 of these are in fact on exhibition in booth number 604, the Courthouse Gallery booth. And what you realize are that on the one hand, these are sculptures, right? These are these tall, about 6 feet high series of multiple pillars that are contrived of a kind of dialogue between curved and rectilinear elements as far as their edgings are concerned, that you can walk around and look at from different angles and see different things. But of course, they're enormously painted up. And in the painting up, they're really paintings that are three-dimensionalized. Or is it they're sculptures that are also paintings? And that are contrived of a whole range not only of ideas with respect to colors, but ideas with respect to influences. So the border between craft and art, the border between painting and sculpture, next image please, the border between sculpture and architecture. Back in the early 80s, George was commissioned to do a sculpture for the main offices of the Johnson Wax headquarters in Racine, Wisconsin. And one of the things that terrified him at the time was that the space was so unconducive to art. And what has he ultimately done? He creates an interior garden by taking, this is about 1985, 1986 or so, all of those sculptured elements that you saw exemplified in one form by way of the Caged Free series, and adding to the verticals, horizontals, creates a whole series of sculptures that really are integrated into the architecture. So you have to ask the question, when does the sculpture end and when does the architecture begin? When does the architecture end? Where does the sculpture begin? So we're talking therefore art craft, painting sculpture, sculpture architecture. Next slide, please. And of course we're talking scale as well, aren't we? Because on the one hand he works on a very, very small scale. This is another sample of early work from the late 40s through about 1957. These are pieces of jewelry. And so you see to your left a necklace. You see to your right a pin. It's actually should not be, it's on scale much smaller relative to the necklace than it appears. And by contrast, if we compare that to the works that we just saw, the Caged Free series or the Johnson Wax interior garden, we're talking about working on the most minute of scales and the most monumental of scales. Next slide, please. We're also talking, where George is concerned and where boundaries are concerned and definitions are concerned, of his refusal to stay governed by one set of stylistic parameters. So on the one hand, we see this work from about 1962 called Apple Painting, or Apples on the Ground. It's from a whole series. But this one, by the way, in particular, involves paper mache. So while the slide may not show it, these things pop out literally from the surface. So it's sculptural as well as it is a flat surface. But there's something expressionistic kind of about the back backdrop, and it's very figurative, and if we move on to the next slide, please. If we look, on the other hand, at a work from 1973 called White Mountain, we can see how stylistically he's completely shifted territory. From the very rough-hewn kind of brushstroke that he used in the previous image, and many like them, a kind of abstract expressionism, but to which is added this papier-mâché element that gives it a sculptural quality. And on the other hand, he's moved in the direction of a kind of pop art, absolute, definitive, line, sharp-edged, using primary colors. Next slide, please, or next image, please. And the same can be seen here in this Spirit Sending One of 1975, which is part and parcel of his work from that era. So we talk about craft and art, we talk about painting and sculpture, we talk about sculpture and architecture, we talk about relief sculpture and full sculpture, we talk about expressionistic and pop art kind of style, we talk about figurative and abstract, we talk about vegetal and geometric, we talk about curvilinear and rectilinear. All of those opposed ideas are crisscrossed in the work of George Wardlaw over the course of his career. If there's one thing that defines all of them, aside from this tension between ideas with which he sticks and the constant transformation of ideas, it's also what I would call his humanism, by which I mean that his intention is to have humans look at, experience, think about what he makes. So you look at that salt shaker and you can't just ignore it because it's a salt shaker, because you see it's a work of art. You see that necklace on someone, and you can't just say, oh, it's a nice necklace. You could not ask questions about it because it's a work of art. You come up to that painting of the apples on the ground because it looks so three-dimensional, and in fact it turns out to be in part three-dimensional. You come into the Johnson Wax headquarters, and you can't ignore this statuary around which you weave yourself as you move through that space. Well, these aspects of George Wardlaw's art, of course, are completely consistent with the biography of George Wardlaw, who starts his life as a Southern Baptist, the son of a very spiritual father in Mississippi, who eventually becomes Jewish, in part because he spent 14 summers teaching in a Jewish summer camp up in Maine, and was so moved by the Friday night services against the sea and against the sky and against the mountains. In part because he met the woman who would become his wife for 51 years, Judy Spivak. In part because a number of his teachers, most importantly perhaps among them Jack Porkov, were not only Jewish, but involved and interested him in questions that they were asking as Jewish artists in the 50s and the 60s. So his art and his life have interwoven each other, just like art and craft and sculpture and painting and architecture and sculpture have interwoven themselves in the course of his career. It's all about transgressing and transcending borders. It's all about a sense of life that is informed by a series of senses of history and art and self and identity. Next image, please. If on the one hand, George is a Southern Baptist from largely Scotch ancestors who becomes Jewish, on the other hand, another line, another thread in the tapestry that makes up his ethnic identity is Cherokee. And the area in which he grew up was rich with the remains of that culture. This work is called Bayou Country, and he's got a whole series that focuses on different tribes that moved along the river where he grew up. Just as off in the woods, in later years, as an adult, he went to find the remains of a horse that had died on the farm where he was growing up, which they buried off into the woods. Think back to that necklace I showed you. That was bone. That was horse bone. That was bone from that horse that he remembered from his childhood, whose bones he sought out, that was part of his early life, that became part of his artistic life. Next image, please. So he's very much part of an identity complex that defines himself, that defines his family, that defines the state where he was born, from which he moves to New York, from which he moves to Massachusetts, that defines the country of which he's a part, that defines the world, the human race of which he's part. And he's influenced by a whole range of art historical kind of ideas. We're back at our interior garden here. You're seeing it from a different angle. And when I first saw an image of this, I was reminded of, next image please, is this work so stylistically different? But this is that famous baldachin, the baldacchino in St. Peter's Church in Rome, done in the early 17th century by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, in which Bernini had to create an entity that would draw the eye of the individual entering the church. It's a football-length church. If any of you have been there, it's enormous. It's a cavern. To be drawn toward the altar at the far end, he needed something impressive. And he creates this magnificent structure that hovers over what is understood to be the site of the grave of St. Peter's. And the thing is, on the one hand, it is in and of itself, it's 30, 40 feet high, a work of architecture. It's like a building. You walk into it, out of it, through it. On the other hand, it is a sculpture. You walk around it, and it is sculptural. He's designed the different elements of it to evoke certain things. And conceptually, George has taken this idea, jumped 500 years forward with it, moved in a secular direction, because this is obviously specifically Catholic in its intention, and created that interior garden, which, by the way, even evokes, think about it, all the way back to Babylonia, the hanging gardens of Babylon. Only in George's interior garden, can we move slide back? In the interior garden, it's not hanging from above, it's growing up from below. So he's taken that idea and reversed it, and of course handled it in a modernist mode by way of a geometric kind of sensibility, very different from what one might suppose the Babylonian gardens, which were literally vegetation hanging here and there, would have been all about. Next image, please. So move 2 forward. Thank you. And again, in terms of influences, if we look at part of his series that is called the Doors series, you can recognize, look to the right. Do you see Picasso? Do you see Miro? In the left in particular, his late stuff. He takes consciously influences from important artists, but then interweaves them in a way that makes them completely different and uniquely his own. Next image, please. And we see this applied in a range of directions to this series that is called Doors. What are doors? It's not doorway, it's doors. Doors are something that stand between you and the space on the other side. Doors show you one side of them, but you don't know what's on the other side of the door until you've gone through the door. So if these are doors, that means I'm looking at this from this angle, with this series of colors, with this series of textures, with this series of forms. And the other side is a mystery, but these are designed to be seen in free space so that I can walk around and then see them from the other side. Next image, please. That one is called Spirit Cold. This one is called To the Night Sun. So there is a whole series of these that are part and parcel of walking through, walking around different ideas. If we think of Passover, we think within the concepts and the ideas of Judaism, of Passover as not only the consummate celebration within the Jewish communal tradition, but the festival that gives us a doorway into so many of its elements, the elements of memory, the elements of making the past become the present, or rather the present become the past, or both, imposing themselves on our thoughts for the future, taking an ancestral idea, the ancestral idea of the Israelite community, coming out of Egypt, going through the wilderness, coming to Sinai, arriving by way of the wandering through the wilderness to the promised land, and applying it generation by generation by generation by generation to a contemporary context. There are dramatic highlights, as you all know, to the Passover story that is celebrated every year on the Jewish calendar. There is the burning bush, which is the place where out in the middle of nowhere, Moses encounters this entity which is miraculous because it burns and is not consumed, and out of it a voice speaks to him, and he is called to his job, which is to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. It's to speak to the Israelites, it's to speak to the Pharaoh. There are, of course, the 10 plagues, which the Egyptians suffer as their Pharaoh keeps saying, no, 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 I'm not going to let the Israelites leave. No, 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 I'm not going to let the Israelites leave. And each time he says, no, I won't. Moses, as the instrument in God's hand, causes another plague to come upon them. There is the final eventual exodus from Egypt, but then the problem of this sea of reeds, or as we improperly tend to render it, the Red Sea, through which the Israelites have to get, and they manage to. The seas part for them, and the Egyptians ultimately, who are pursuing them, are caught within the seas. There is Mount Sinai, where Moses spends 40 days and 40 nights, and from which he comes down in triumph with the Ten Commandments, but it's also traumatic, because the faith of the Israelites, when he's gone so long, is tested. And the Ten Commandments bring obligations for them of a covenantal sort between God and themselves. There is the wandering led for 40 years by a pillar of fire by night, and a pillar of smoke by day, hovering over the tabernacle where the tablets of the law are kept. Well, in George Wardlaw's Wandering Through Life and Wandering Through Art, next image please, where he walks around or walks through or offers us paradox. This is another work from the Doors series called Entrance. And again, think of the paradox. Generally one thinks of entrance as an opening. This is an opening, but not in the conventional sense. This is an opening in that you've got to walk around it to see what's on the other side again. He walks through doors. He walks through passages. Next image, please. And so again, we think of the work Interior Garden, where one walks through and around and around and through. But the interesting thing about this work called Interior Garden is it was part of a series of works. The previous image on the screen was part of a series of works called Doors. This was part of a series of works called Passages. And this was the 10th. Passages 10 was the Interior Garden complex. Passages 11, next slide please, is called Exodus. And it represents, done in 1987-1988, the first work where George consciously and overtly expressed his Jewish identity. This is 30 years after his conversion. 30 years, give or take, after his marriage to Judy. This is the first work, this first complex work, in which he overtly engages his Jewish identity. It has 7 parts to it. So you can see left, the red to the left, and to the right, and here's 3rd and 4th in front of us, and then a series of 3 beyond us. Each of these works can be displayed and seen and understood by itself, in which case each becomes largely a sculpture, or the whole can be seen as it is here, installed as one compendium, in which case it becomes even more architectural because of the way you walk around and through it. And if one looks, for example, at the number 1 to the right, this one is called Passage of Light, or Fire, and Pillar of Cloud. So on the one hand, we recognize that it offers an allusion to the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by day that, hovering over the tabernacle, led the Israelites through the wilderness. And you can see to the left the dark black suggesting smoke, to the right the reddish suggesting fire, but there's more, of course. Look to the upper reaches of it, and you see those 2 white entities coming out of those 2 pillars, those complex, not simplex pillars. And they tend to evoke chimneys, and they can't not evoke in a post-Holocaust world where the chimney has become an icon for the Jewish experience in the Holocaust, for Auschwitz, invoking that as well. So simultaneously, this work is about distant history and recent history. It's about layers and interweaving components that make up one's identity. It's about the compendium of not surviving and surviving that is part of that experience. I call your attention, among the myriad details, to the work at the opposite end of this configuration here. The one that is number 5, called Creation, because on the far left you can probably see that it's a series of actually 7 elements rising from bottom to top on that series of horizontal bases. And 7, of course, is not only the creation cycle, but in the context of Exodus, remember that's the overall title of this work, Passages 11, Exodus. The most perhaps arguably important of the 10 Commandments, the commandment to keep the 7th day holy, because it's what would define the Israelites and their descendants over the generations as a people with its own covenantal concerns with God, is the keeping of that day sacred, which is offered as a seventh day in part in reference to the creation cycle in Genesis, where God rests on the seventh day, and so the world, as it were, is physically complete. And so the Sabbath mirrors that, but it also mirrors the obligation implied by what happens in Genesis after the physical completion of the universe. And that is, from Adam forward to our own time, the spiritual, the psychological, the moral, the ethical ordering of the universe is by definition and by deliberation left by God incomplete, and we're obliged to become part of the process of trying to complete it. That process is called in Hebrew tikkun olam, the repairing of the world. It's a concept with which the abstract expressionists who included Twarkov among them in the 50s and 60s were very concerned and very focused. It's something that George very much picked up in his association with them. Well, as George's career moves into the later 80s, next slide please, he began a second series called Exodus 2 from 1989 to 1992. Still focused, therefore, on the idea of the Exodus and its implications and its importance for identity, for his Jewish identity, but also for the connection between that Jewish identity and the broad identity of human beings. This is the central piece of the seven that makes up Exodus 2, and it's called Passover. And if you look very carefully, again, we've got paradox here. If you think of Passover and you look at this piece, you can't not, it seems to me, think of a doorway. And so you have a door in the center, and left and right, as it were, the vertical elements upon which in the 10th plague the Israelites are said to have been instructed by Moses to smear blood, so that when the angel of death worked its way through Egypt, he would pass over the Israelite houses. In the Egyptian houses, the firstborn, of course, perish. So the interesting thing here is, look at not only the texture, but the color seeping through the door there. There's a reddish quality to it, a blood quality to it. But we would expect it to be left or right on the doorposts, which is what the text says. So this is another element of George's refusing to be confined by the category and boundaries that the specifics of text imply, because he's very conscious of the fact that within the Jewish tradition, what we call midrash, digging beneath the surface of the text, has existed for 2,000 years. The obligation, and not just the opportunity, to try and understand what lies beneath the surface of the text and to figure out new ways of understanding it. Next image, please. Another among the seven elements that make up Exodus 2 is this one. Again, we're talking 1989 to 1992. And again, we're talking about seven elements that make up the Exodus 2 compendium, just as in the Exodus 1, there were seven components. This one is called warning signs. This is the piece through which I first got to know George Wardlaw's work. I was working on an exhibition at the end of the 90s called Jewish Artists, on the Edge. And I was looking for artists whose work, in one way or another, was edgy. And in his case, not only was George's art edgy, but of course he himself, as I've been saying for the last half hour, is on the edge between all of these different aspects of identity, including Jewish and other elements. So he was a perfect artist for my exhibition. And the work we showed was this one, to repeat, called Warning Signs. And I'll call your attention to just two features of it. One, of course, is its architectural/sculptural structure. That is, at one and the same time, it has a kind of pyramidal quality to it. So it evokes the pyramids of Egypt. On the other hand, by the way, its pyramidal structure is broader than that. You could see this in Central America, not all that far from here, in terms of the stepped quality. Of course, the earliest Egyptian pyramids were also stepped. But on the other hand, it has a mountainous kind of quality to it. So it evokes the mountain, Mount Sinai, where the covenant was established between the Israelites and God, with Moses as the intermediary. That's one aspect of it that I'm calling to your attention. The second, which is hard to see on a slide, is that as with all of these works, it's enormously textural, and specifically this one, if you look closely at it, it's swarming with locusts. So it also suggests, therefore, one of those plagues that was part and parcel of the process through which the Israelites made their way eventually out of Egypt. 6 of the 7 parts of Exodus 2 deal with the book of Exodus and stories from it. Next image, please. But one of them backtracks all the way to Genesis. And not surprising, once again we see, well, it's called Sabbath creation. And once again you recognize the 7 different elements that make up the creation cycle. And one might even suppose, well, the light and the darkness, look at the outer edges, white and black. Colors that would suggest the separation of sea from sky. Colors that would suggest the creation of animals in the sea, animals on the land. The culmination created element, which in the center has that earth color. Adam. Adam in Hebrew comes from Adama, meaning earth. He's an earthman, as probably most of you know. On the other hand, of course, Adam was created on the 6th day, right? God rested on the 7th day. So we can't do a simple, straightforward, okay, 7, therefore 7, because there aren't 7 days of creation. We say it, but there's 6 days of creation. The 7th day is the day of rest. Sabbath creation, which is what it is called. On the other hand, of course, this image evokes on a gigantic scale the most frequently used image in the terms of the symbolic language of Jewish art going back 2,000 years, and that's the 7-branched candelabrum. The candelabrum that on the one hand stood in the temple, and so it implies the hope eventually for a kind of messianic era in which literally or metaphorically, depending upon whom you ask, the temple would be rebuilt. On the other hand, in its 7-ness, that menorah itself reminds Jews over the course of history of the commandment to keep the 7th day holy, given in the context of Sinai, given in the context of coming from servitude to freedom, from Egypt to the Promised Land, and with it all the obligations that pertain to the covenant. So all of that and more is evoked in terms of the symbolic language of this work, which is, if we ignore everything I just said, just a stunning work to confront in terms of its color, in terms of its texture, in terms of its form. Next image, please. The beginning of Moses' calling is implied and suggested by this work called Mount Horeb, Burning Bush. And by the way, this one you can see on display. It's in booth 403, except there's no number on that booth. But you'll find it if you follow your numbers otherwise. And if this is the burning bush, well, you can see this wonderfully irregular, fiery red kind of entity rising before you, held against a backdrop, which on the one hand gives you the kind of awesome whiteness and darkness, light and then black, of the desert sky by day and by night. It puts in abstract terms the kind of experience that one might imagine Moses having had in Exodus 3 when he encounters this extraordinary vision in the middle of nowhere. Next image, please. Another from this series is the one, you can also see this on exhibition. You'll have to find it. It's off beyond booth 604, but it's near the VIP lounge. That's where you're all heading anyway, so. And it's called Parting of the Red Sea. And what you can see from this angle, of course, is the redness of the sea on the one side. What you can't see on the other side is blueness. So two different sea colors, sea elements that oppose each other, kind of like the fate of the Israelites coming through, and you can wander through this piece, as opposed to the fate of the Egyptians pursuing them and wandering through. It is a piece that you wander through as much as you wander around it. It is a piece that is as much a work of architecture, a kind of booth, a sukkah, as it is a work of sculpture. Next image, please. And this work is also visible in the non-numbered booth 403, to which I keep referring. And this, of course, is called Ark of the Covenant. It is, in a way, the centerpiece of the whole compendium when the whole thing is installed as a compendium. And one can recognize these boxes as the boxes in which, or a rendering of the boxes in which the tablets of the law brought down from Sinai would have been carried for those 40 years through the wilderness. The boxes over which would have hovered a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud by night and by day to lead the Israelites in a kind of tangible way through the wilderness. A box that would have been carried when they moved forward on the shoulders of priests for whom these bars are therefore in place, and a box which George Wardlaw has rendered as a double box, lower and upper, as if to reinforce the notion that what resides within is something that connects lower and upper worlds, earth and heaven, ourselves and divinity. Moreover, you can see these beautifully patterned elements, 3 of which are obvious on the front here, 3 on the other side, 2 on each of the narrow sides, giving you 10, which means that these 10 panels represent, in a very simple arithmetic symbolic way, the 10 Commandments, which is, of course, what is contained within. And finally, if you look very carefully, you can see, for example, on the upper right, the yellow one, but it's true of all of them, in George Wardlaw's methodology, he paints and he scrapes away, and he paints and he scrapes away, and he incises and he paints, so you can see embedded within the patterns perfect circles, perfect triangles, perfect geometric forms that on the one hand suggest in being perfect the notion of God, over and against the highly irregular expressionistic surfaces which in being imperfect suggest us. And remind us that the whole point of this kind of work is to reflect on the idea of a divine-human relationship whereby we're obliged to assist in the final perfection of the world. Even more, it seems to me, than in Exodus 1, this series in Exodus 2, of which I've just shown you some, can stand alone or together like the tribes of Israel. They're part of a compendium called Israel. They're individuated tribes. Each tribe is individuated in terms of the families that make it up. Every family is individuated in terms of the individuals that make it up. So there's a constant tension between the individual elements that make up a compendium and the compendium as a unity. Or, to quote George Wardlaw himself, organized similarly to the family unit, composed of many parts, that one day will separate and go their own ways, but reunite from time to time. And when we think of the way in which each of these 2 large contrivances is sevenfold, we think not only on the one hand of the menorah and the Sabbath and the creation story, but we think of the importance of sevenness in the pre-Jewish, pre-Christian, pre-Muslim traditions of Egypt and Mesopotamia, among others, which pertains because there are 7 wanderers across the heavens, 7 planets, which pertains to the whole idea of perfection and divinity. And on the other hand, that sevenness becomes an important number not only in the Jewish tradition, but in the Christian tradition, 7 virtues, 7 sins. In the Muslim tradition, 7 heavens. That sevenness has something not just specifically Jewish, but also broadly universal and humanistic. So George also produced with this second Exodus series a whole series of paintings, mostly on mylar. Next image, please, with these sculptures. So this one, for example, is part of a series called Graven Images. It's Graven Images number 2. Or, next image, please. A series from the 10 Commandments. This one is called Honor Thy Father and Thy Mother. These are all from 1993, 1994. And one could suppose that mother and father are what are contained in the space below, different but absolutely equal. Because the Midrash, in discussing that, makes the observation that both parents are to be honored equally and not the one more than the other. Next image, please. Or this work, which is simply called 10 Commandments 4. But of course the 4th commandment is, we're back there again, the commandment to keep the Sabbath. So now look at the way he has proportioned this work. There is a strip. We might be reminded in part of Barnett Newman's zips, but this is very different in terms of the texture. That zip to the right occupies 1/7 of the space. So it's as if coming across, we have a solid series of undifferentiated 6 areas that suggest the days of creation, and the 7th, separate, is the day of rest, the Sabbath. Next slide, please. And so too, a whole series that deal with the plagues. So to your left, these are from 1995, warning signs, the first plague. And again, it's not just richly textured, but if you could look at it with a better eye than the slide allows you to, you'd see the fish swimming around and be reminded of that first plague, which turned the sea of the Nile into blood, and which caused eventually frogs and all kinds of elements that typically belong in the water to overrun the land. And to the right, of course, is the 10th plague. And that blood red says it all. That which was painted on the doorways of the Israelite houses so the Israelites survived is what we see here. Because this gets us to the middle of the 90s, as George Wardlaw's career has continued to flourish, next image please, into the last decade and a half or so, he's continued to paint in extraordinary ways, or to use the phrase that is used in that book, bringing the numinous, bringing that which is associated with what is beyond us, down to our reality. This is a series that he's been doing that are focused on Maine. So in a way he's come full circle back to where he first began to think about his own spirituality in new ways, on the coast of Maine. And this particular one, guess what it's called? Multiple Identities. It's from that Maine series. It's from 2009 or so. And of course, on the one hand, you recognize in a very stylized way the sea, the sky, the land. On the other hand, very interestingly, this empty space in the middle of all of that. And of course, he's playing with what is a long art historical issue, positive and negative space. Is it that the whiteness in that central area is empty, it's negative space, surrounded by positive, the colored spaces around it? Or is it the case that what we have is a colored frame, which is not the real subject? The subject is what's in the center, and the white isn't emptiness, the white is, let's say, purity. Or is it, to be consistent with this whole story, one of blurring lines between these categories without making it simple for the viewer to say, ah, this is what it is, no, that's what it is. This is what it is, that's what it is. I mean, that's what religion and art have been arguing about, this is and that's, and I've got it, no, I've got it, no, you've got it, no, you've got it, for as long as there have been humans around. Next image, please. Two last images. In the last year, he's moved in a further direction which in one way brings him back to some of where he began with, that more expressionist, that looser brushwork that he had in the beginning of his career, and then it became much tighter, and now it's loosened gradually up again. But by the way, if you think of late Rembrandt, or if you think of late Titian, their brushwork also becomes freer as perhaps they become freer in their later years, as George clearly has. This one is called MN effect. MN are the initials of one of those campers from Maine of a zillion years ago who visited his studio while he was working on this 6 or 7 months ago, and saw what he was doing and said, wait, George, stop, don't go further, you're going to mess it up. She was so excited, she was so enthusiastic, she was so enthralled that she was trying to instruct the instructor about what not to do that would mess up his work. And it caused George, he said, you know, for the first time in years, I stopped and looked at my work with eyes that in 65 years I hadn't really used. Eyes that had been lent to me by someone else's comment. I didn't entirely follow her instruction. I did add a little bit more here on the right. But the whole idea of making me re-look at nearly the age of 85 at my own work as I'm making it was a new effect, hence the MN effect. And with that in mind, last image, the last work that I'm showing you, which is from this past year, is called New Life. And it reflects in its handling of very distinct lines and yet a very expressionistic, loose kind of texturing between it. Fundamental, basic, primary colors. A canvas, which is very sculptural, because when you see this close up, you realize how thick the patina is. It's all about his continuous renewal. It's all about his continuous transcending and transgressing of borders, of passages, of artistic and spiritual and religious and ethnic identities. It's all about a rather magnificent artist, and I want to call to your attention, as was stated before I began to speak, that the book that is the first book to cover 60 years of George's work is available for signing afterwards, and Karen Wilkes, who runs the gallery that represents him, will be there to help you out. And there's a show price. It's $55 as opposed to the ordinary $65 price. Did I miss anything about that? All right, this is Karen. Look for her. They'll be just outside the door, and I thank you all very much for your attention.